Stephen Yates is president, public policy and business consultancy at DC International Advisory. Joins us from DC. Still with us, Adrian, our guest host from JP at Morgan, of course. Stephen, good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. Carney says that President Obama is still weighing his options. It seems like the option list is very, very short indeed. Naval vessels from afar launching Tomahawks, and that's about it. Is that your take on the situation?
That's about what we're hearing in D.C. these days. A limited strike with a limited objective, basically to send a message that chemical weapons shouldn't be used, but very little description of what they really expect to come after that.
So a limited strike from afar, that doesn't sound like a surgical strike, trying to send a message. I mean, how targeted could these attacks be, and what could they do to abate the deployment of chemical weapons in that country?
Well, the only thing that would really make sense to me is if they happen to know with 100% confidence where all of the chemical weapons are. And I doubt that. And if they did know where all of them were, and they had such a strike that made it so that Syria could never constitute that kind of an attack again in the future, then I might understand this a little bit. But I don't know what the theory is about striking them once as sort of a slap on the wrist punishment, and then saying, don't do this again, and believe that someone who's had 100,000 of his own civilians killed in the last 2 years will stop.
Stephen, is part of the story here the U.S. losing influence in the Middle East, with funding coming from the GCC countries, also coming from Iran, which is effectively providing the sort of capital for a proxy war between these different parties, and it just makes the U.S. a little bit less relevant in the story?
I think there's very much truth to that. And part of that, I think, is by design and not objectionable to the Obama administration. They came into office after the perceived negatives of a decade of war, and a little bit of withdrawal they saw as a positive in the region. And there is a lot of hesitancy in the United States about intervention. I mean, polls aren't the end-all and be-all of things, but I think it's about 9% support in the public for a strike on Syria.
Stephen, it seems like it is the Syrians themselves, it is the people under siege who are in a lose-lose situation. I mean, the fear on the ground there is that the mistakes of Libya and Iraq are repeated, where civilian targets get hit. I mean, you can't always control where a cruise missile is going to go. And, you know, as we've discussed, you know, it's not like a nuclear reprocessing facility. I mean, biological weapons, chemical weapons, they're not huge facilities that show up on a satellite image. This really puts the people in a very, very tough situation.
I think it certainly does. That's why I think in war, half measures are probably worse than no measures. And I just don't see a real strategy to shape an outcome. What the Syrian people need is an end to the conflict. They need some way forward for their own future. This strike aimed at chemical weapons only doesn't even begin to address that. And of course, Syria is but one conflict in this broad, troubled region, with no answer from the United States or any sense of an allied coalition.
Let's talk about the broader region, Stephen. If there is military action, then number one, is that going to provoke a response from Iran? We know that it backs the al-Assad regime. And number two, is it going to complicate the atmospherics of the nuclear negotiations?
I do believe it would complicate the atmosphere of the nuclear negotiations, but frankly, I think reasonable people had their doubts about where those may be going. Many people see Iran as having made a strategic decision to move in this direction, so maybe that doesn't matter as much. But there have been a lot of threats about whether Iran or its friends in Hezbollah might launch an attack on Israel in response to the attack on Syria. Basically, not attacking the United States directly, but making matters worse in the broader Middle East in retaliation.
Oh dear, what a mess. It sounds like it's almost unsalvageable the way things are going. Stephen, thanks for staying back to be with us. We'll talk soon. Stephen Yates, DC International Advisory. Lisa.